Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1-hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. Now, the reason I think it is crucial to discuss subaltern studies within the context of Pakistani historiography, but also Pakistani cultural production, is to ask ourselves what kind of history officially is being taught in Pakistan. What kind of history is excluded from the national narratives, and what are the implications for that? So if you look at, starting with the actual Subaltern Studies Collective, which came from India, I'm holding right now at least 10 volumes, right, that they produced over the years. Now, the project itself was launched by Ranajit Guha and people like Partha Chatterjee and others, mostly leftist scholars or Marxist scholars, but it eventually also becomes a culturalist project, and that's one of the critiques of it. But what they were dealing with, the original subaltern studies scholars, people like Ranajit Guha and others, were first responding to two major things. One, the imperial nature of South Asian studies itself, right? South Asian studies traditionally focused on the mainstream narratives of independence struggles, of narratives told by the elite, national elite and international elite. And they were responding to that, and the project was of recovery. Recovery of what? Recovery of silenced histories, right? Silenced demographics, and people whose histories or whose views of the nation or national history were either excluded from national histories or marginalized or totally obliterated and silenced. Now, the main thing to keep in mind then, the project as subaltern studies within the Indian context, what they ended up doing in these 10 volumes was offering retrieved histories of silenced groups, histories that were not included in the mainstream Indian national narrative. So their argument was that the way Indian history is taught, narrated, recorded, and published is dominantly representative of the dominant class, of the dominant political parties, and that the whole purpose of the project then was to go and retrieve. So, if you look at India, what are the silenced and subaltern constituencies? Of course, there are millions of Dalit citizens of India who traditionally have been, even when they've been producing great works, they have been excluded from the political power, but also from the cultural power within the mainstream Indian academic and cultural narrative. Similarly, there are the Adivasis, right? Hill tribes, all these people who are excluded from when people tell the history of rise of India or Indian independence. So if you look through these 10 volumes, and I highly recommend it, ask your library to get these. I have volume 1 in my hand, which was edited by Ranajit Guha himself. And the essays included are one from Ranajit Guha, one from Partha Chatterjee, famous for his work, Nation and Its Fragments, one by Shahid Amin, right? And it's on rural indebtedness, and a few other by some scholars. But if you look at these essays, all of them are trying to recover and articulate whatever histories may not have been recorded, or if they were recorded, not privileged within Indian historiography. So what does the Subaltern Studies Project end up doing? Like, on one level, it complicates the national narrative and in a way enriches it, right? Enriches it by saying, okay, 1857, you want to talk about the rebellion? Well, what about you talk about the Queen of Awadh, and you talk about Rani of Jhansi and others, but what about Mullah of Awadh? What about his rebellion? What about these people who are not included? Even in the liberation narratives, they are not included, right? So it enriches Indian historiography because it makes available for Indians and for people who study South Asian studies these narratives that then give us a more complex view of Indian history, right? This is similar to what, and they eventually become post-structuralists, they start as Marxists, similar to what Foucault calls the bruised knowledge or buried knowledge, which constantly is in opposition to the mainstream knowledge. And one purpose of the intellectual is to recover that silenced and bruised knowledge, right? And juxtapose it against the mainstream narrative. And in the end, what that will end up doing is it would end up shifting, right? Or at least disturbing the normative structure of the mainstream narrative. Now, if you look at Pakistani historiography, and I already pre-apologize if I offend anyone. That is not my aim ever at all. So the Pakistani historiography, before even we go into that history, is imbued with a certain kind of cultural fragility. And what do I mean by that? That there is a certain kind of anxiety in Pakistani historiography. And there are material causes for that. The main material cause being that the idea of Pakistan had to be constructed, had to be articulated, had to be claimed, right? It was prompted, of course, by the fear of minoritization, but then it becomes political and the entire Pakistan movement and all. In the process of doing that, the Pakistani history, as it is being taught, right? It's being taught in two ways. One is the mandatory subject of Pakistan studies, right? And the other is history of subcontinent, and within that, history of Pakistan. In both those scenarios, the Pakistani historiography is imbued with this anxiety to keep the narrative of Pakistan stable, right? Now, since so much of Pakistani narrative depends on discursive practices of producing that narrative, right? What is Pakistan? That was the question that people used to ask of Mr. Jinnah. What do you mean by Pakistan? If you have read your Aisha Jalal, you already know that one reason that he never really clearly articulated what he meant by Pakistan was because he didn't want to be pinned down. Right? He was fighting two constituencies, right? That even is a mainstream narrative, right? But we'll go into that. So this anxiety, what it forces Pakistani historians to do is that instead of writing history, they end up writing hagiography, right? And when they write hagiographies, there are these larger than life figures who somehow like single-handedly moved the clock of history, right? And then history itself, its recording becomes predominantly Islamized. And there are, of course, psychological and material reasons for that. One reason, and as I explained in my first book, Constructing Pakistan, right, like probably in my reading of Jinnah, he didn't want to, establish an Islamic republic. His idea was to have a space safe enough for Muslims to be a majority. But Islam becomes the mobilizing ideology, right? And then retroactively, what we have made Islam the only narrative of Pakistani historiography. When you do that, right, what is excluded then automatically are all the minorities and their voices and their struggles for Pakistan, right? And that history doesn't exist. I mean, there is no recorded official history of how did the minorities participate in it? How did they support Mr. Jinnah, right? What was supposed to be their role historically, according to Mr. Jinnah, even though in his speeches, he obviously mentions that they will be equal citizens of Pakistan. So what ends up happening is that the dominant historiography of Pakistan then starts with Muhammad bin Qasim and Dibul ki Fatahat or Salahuddin, not Salahuddin, Mahmud of Ghazni attacking India like 16 times. And then that is also romanticized. I mean, why was he attacking India every year? I mean, obviously not to bring Islam to India. Islam was already coming to India through the works of Sufia and Awliya, right? He was coming for plunder, right? But we have mythologized that history and somehow posited the history that Pakistanis claim as this history of constant warfare and valor and all that. So there is officially no subaltern studies project in Pakistan. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. Not at the scale of Subaltern Studies Collective in India. Okay, and there are material and ideological reasons for that. Ideological, I already mentioned, is the anxiety about national identity. An anxiety that the Indians, by and large, do not have to face on the dominant level because India has always been there. Pakistan had to be imagined, right, fought for and created as a separate nation. And in the process of doing so, the narrative needed to be developed. That narrative is the dominant narrative of Muslims, even though Mr. Jinnah himself, was quite secular. Right? So what I'm trying to say here is, one, that there is no official subaltern historiography project in Pakistan. But I will remind you that there is subaltern historiography going on in Pakistan. So ideological reasons are already there. Material reasons are that the thought in Pakistan, critical thought in Pakistan, right, is controlled directly or indirectly, coerced through different constituencies. Okay, some of them you already know. So people who are writing and thinking about Pakistan have to worry about what the Maulvis are going to say, right? So that already tells you that there are certain territories of thought you cannot visit, not publicly at least. Nothing is for debate. And this comes from a religious tradition, which in 10th century was debating the nature of God. I have volumes of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd right sitting on my desk where they're basically rationally talking about the possibility of existence of God, right? This is the tradition that so-called Muslims draw on. But in Pakistan, if you go slightly off the mark and say something slightly radical, chances are your life would be threatened. That's a fact. I'm not deriding Pakistan. I love Pakistan, but that's the kind of culture we have created. The others are our institutions. I was part of one of them, right, for 14 years of my life. These institutions also try to control how stories are told, how history is recorded, how people teach it, how people talk about it. So when you have so many implications to think about, right? And then institutional resources. Would a university fund a project that says, I want to go and recover, the Christian narratives? No. So all these things, then where is the funding going to? Pakistan studies, right? Iqbaliyat, right? Which university, if you can name one, says, oh, we will fund a project that goes and studies, the culture of the dancing girls, right? Or the culture of, the trans people who are a living cultural entity within Pakistan, right? Which university will fund that? So institutionally, there is a bias against dominant history, right? And then there are different kinds of controls that force people to just follow the line and write and publish and teach within the prescribed narrative that is the national narrative. Now, I had mentioned that there are subaltern histories, okay? But they've been sidelined. If you go to Sindh and try to read in Sindhi, that's the next language I want to learn. There is rich tradition of leftist thought in Sindh. I mean, how many of you sitting in Punjab and elsewhere know the name of Sobo Gyan Chandani, who just recently died, I think 2 years ago? Gyan Chandani was one of the leading Sindhi Marxist writers. People in the world know him, right? No one in Pakistan knows him other than in Sindh. How many of you know who Iqbal Masih was? right? What did he do? Like a 12-year-old boy, right, who fought for the rights of children who were in bonded labor, right, who has a Wikipedia entry, but do we teach him in our schools, right? That is your subaltern history. How many of us know who Rana Chandra Singh was, right? One of the founding fathers of Pakistan People's Party, right? Or the Soda Rajputs of Tharparkar. I mean, no one outside of Sindh knows that there is a sizable Hindu population in Sindh who considers themselves quintessentially Pakistani, that Sindh has had that tradition. You go to KPK and look at the writings of Bacha Khan, Dr. Khan Sahib and others, right? These are subaltern histories. These were people who were opposed to the creation of Pakistan for philosophical and political reasons, right? But we declared them traitors, we declared them Ghaddar, GM Sayyid, same. So the subaltern histories do exist. It's just that they are not acknowledged by those who have the power to decide what would be Pakistan studies, right? And what does that do to Pakistani culture, right? It enervates it. It makes it weak, like less complex, more dependent on these grand narratives of religion. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.